All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Alex Minami. I use he, him pronouns, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to Tagney Jones Hall. I'm the Associate Director of Community Engagement here at Seattle Opera, where I have the honor of curating events like this community conversation this evening on the subject of gender fluidity in opera, a topic to which our current production of Handel's Alcina lends itself very well. I also have the honor of introducing our panelists today, and before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish peoples, who since time immemorial have been stewards of this land and its waterways and continue to shape the Puget Sound region today. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with indigenous communities, and we recognize that it is our collective responsibility to honor, preserve, and know the land we are on. So, I have a few bios to get through today, so bear with me. But before I do that, I'm sure those of you who have seen some of the performances this past weekend of Alcina will recognize, or maybe not recognize, some of our cast members from Alcina. So I'd really like to just begin with a special thank you to the 3 cast members who are joining this panel this evening, because they have had a busy few weeks, and we're so honored to be able to spend this extra time with you all this evening. So thank you very much. I'm kind of going out of order a little bit, so if I go out of order that you're in, just kind of wave your hands so people know who you are. First, I'll start with C.E. Adamson, mezzo-soprano, and she occupies a fluid space as an operatic talent, capable of treading the beguiling and liminal space between the countertenor and mezzo-soprano. C's vocal versatility has been well showcased in roles such as Oberon in Britain's Midsummer Night's Dream, the Sorceress in Dido and Aeneas, Die dritte Dame in Die Zauberflöte, and Mercedes in Carmen. C is also a conductor, teacher, arts advocate, and administrator, and also works as an administrator in higher education. C is currently pursuing a Doctor of Musical Arts in vocal performance with additional studies in choral conducting at the University of Washington. Before then, C studied at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama based in London, where she received a Master of Music and Master of Performance degrees, and was designated a Guildhall Artist. Other education includes music degrees from Shenandoah Conservatory at Shenandoah University, and undergraduate degrees in music accounting and management from Franklin Pierce University. You really do it all, see. Anita Spritzer is a beloved fixture of the Seattle drag scene, and actually, you will have a chance later on this month to watch her perform here in this very same space, Tagney Jones Hall, as part of our Queens of the Night program, our Bravo Halloween party on October the 27th. Her alter ego, tenor and Tacoma native John Marzano, is a prominent figure in the region's opera scene. He earned a Bachelor of Music in Vocal Performance from Pacific Lutheran University, studying under Barry Johnson, another frequent presence on Seattle Opera's stages. He then studied at the New England Conservatory and has since graced the stages of PLU Opera, Portland Opera, Seattle Symphony, Symphony Tacoma, Tacoma Opera, Vashon Opera, and of course Seattle Opera, where he has sung in roles in La Traviata, Samson and Delilah, and Carmen, and is currently singing the role of Oronte in Alcina. He won several awards from the Metropolitan Opera, and in 2021 was a national semifinalist in the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions. Thank you for being here, John. And Anita. All right, countertenor Randall Scotting is sought after by some of the world's leading opera houses. After his voice training at Juilliard and the University of Colorado, he received a Ph.D. from the Royal College of Music, where he focused on forgotten 18th century operas. So you're in the right spot, Randall. In 2019, he debuted at the Royal Opera House as Apollo in David McVicker's acclaimed production of Britain's Death in Venice. In 2022, he joined the roster of the Metropolitan Opera, covering roles in Handel's Agrippina and Matthew O'Coin's Eurydice. And he debuted at the Bayerische Staatsoper and Staatsoper Hamburg. He recently released 2 albums. The first is The Crown, Heroic Arias for Senesino, recorded with the orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. And the second album is Lovesick, a collaboration with Stephen Stubbs, a name very familiar to us here in Seattle. Seattle audiences will also remember Randall's enchanting past appearances as Prince Thomas in Handel's Semele in 2015 and The Refugee in our filmed version of Jonathan Dove's Flight in 2021. And he is currently singing the role of Ruggiero in Handel's El Cino. Annie Searcy crossed out a bunch of the things on her bio to speed things along. Thank you, Dr. Searcy. Dr. Anne Searcy is an assistant professor in the music history program at the University of Washington School of Music. She is currently investigating the intersections of music, politics, and dance. Her book, Ballet in the Cold War, A Soviet-American Exchange, was published by Oxford University Press. Redacted. Among the recent courses she has taught at UW is Gender and Music, in which she investigated, among other topics, gender issues in opera. Thank you for being here. Okay, we're almost there. Lastly, our moderator for this evening is mezzo-soprano Nina Yoshida Nelsen, whose stellar work, both on and off stage, has made her very dear to our hearts here at Seattle Opera. She is currently singing the role of Melissa in Handel's El Cino, a role, mind you, that was originally written as a male role, a bass role. She's a mezzo-soprano, so we'll get into a little bit of that. And next month, she will debut the title role of Carmen with Indianapolis Opera. She was here actually just this past June singing the role of Khan in Huang Ruo's Bound, and she made her Seattle Opera debut as Hiroko Kobayashi in Jack Perla's An American Dream in 2015. She has performed with many leading companies in North America, including Atlanta Opera, Boston Lyric Opera, Houston Grand Opera, Lyric Opera of Chicago, Opera Santa Barbara, Santa Fe Opera, Washington National Opera, and many, many more. Nina serves as artistic advisor at Boston Lyric Opera, where they just produced an innovative new interpretation of Madame Butterfly. As the co-founder and president of the Asian Opera Alliance, Nina is a leading advocate for racial equity in the opera industry today. Thank you all very much for being here, and a special thank you to you, Nina, for leading tonight's talk.
Thank you, Alex. Something I find incredibly important to talk about when I moderate panels is to start with the why. Why is it important for us to be having this conversation today? When Seattle Opera first asked me if I would moderate this conversation, my question was, am I the right person to be doing this? I'm a cisgender Asian American woman with no lived experience as a queer person. But after thinking about it for a while, my mind was taken back to a time when personally I do a lot of advocating for racial diversification, and a white colleague reminded me that it should not always be my responsibility to educate and advocate for people of color. And when my colleague stepped up for me and held some of that responsibility in that room, it was like a huge weight was lifted from my shoulders. Being an ally and learning how and when to step up is something that we're not often taught. So today, as your moderator, I come as an ally, asking how we can learn both from our history and the lived experiences of the people on this panel about a topic that has not often been openly talked about. And why is it important to hear from the people on this panel? Because if we don't share our stories, they become erased. And if we erase our stories, we are bound to repeat mistakes. The only way to learn and make our future better than our past is by listening and then learning. Art has always been a political statement. As Lin-Manuel Miranda recently said, all art is political. Art lives in the world, and we exist in the world, and we cannot create honest work about the world in which we live without reflecting it. What artists can do is bring stories to the table that are unshakably true, stories that, once you've heard them, won't let you return to what you thought before. Handel's opera Alcina was first presented in London in 1735 in a brand new 1,400-seat theater at Covent Garden. So how do we take an opera that was premiered almost 300 years ago and make the message relevant to an audience today? Especially with an opera like Alcina, where the very complex plot lies somewhere between human love and magical passion. What we as artists have attempted to do on the stage is to tell a story of humanity, a story that's that everyone in our audiences can find something to relate to. So a hot button topic in today's society is human rights in relation to sexuality and gender. In our production, we see a man who sings what would typically be considered in a women's range, and we see a woman dressed as a man playing a woman who is all in disguise, and then we see my character, Melissa, who's normally sung by a bass, but here I'm singing it. A little bit of trivia for you. I believe I sing the lowest note that is sung on stage in the whole night in tribute to the bass who normally sings it. So the question is, how can the fluidity of gender in Alcina influence our community and the way we treat each other as human beings? What you will see on stage is a shift away from this idea of binary. And that is something that is extremely relevant in today's culture. In fact, you might have heard people say gender is a construct, just like race and time. But what does that actually mean? Think about the word constructed. Planned Parenthood defines gender as, quote, a social and legal status and set of expectations from society about behaviors, characteristics, and thoughts. Each culture has standards about the way people should behave based on their gender. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society, and it can change over time. So as we witness rights being taken away from women and the queer community, and laws specifically being created to harm the trans community, the question we ask today is, what happens when we move our mind away from the binary and focus instead on each person as a human being? How does our thought process change when we move away from the idea that in binary form everything must be good versus evil, us versus them, black or white, male or female? And most importantly, how can we, as a community of artists, be models and allies for the inclusive society we would ideally like to see? So today, I have 4 fabulous guests here with me to discuss exactly this. We'll start our conversation by talking about the historical aspects of gender in Baroque opera, and then we will move into talking about gender in today's society. We'll end the conversation with a question and answer period from the audience, so please save any questions you have until the end, and we're gonna get going. My first question is for Annie. I'm hoping you will tell us a little bit about the history behind the concept of gender in Baroque opera. In Handel's day, who would have sung all the roles in Alcina, and how and why has that changed today?
Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction to the panel. Gender, as much as it's a topic of great consideration today, was also something hotly debated in the 17th and 18th century. People were trying to figure out what gender roles should be in society, how they should be defined, who should do what, and what would make, for them, the big questions, a good woman and a good man. And this comes up a ton in Baroque opera. It is essentially the main issue at stake in most 17th and early 18th century operas. And a lot of what they were trying to do through what's a lot of often these historical stories or mythological stories or fake historical stories more often is try to present different images of what an exceptional woman, an exceptional man would be. Exceptional, maybe because they were exceptionally great, maybe because they were exceptionally bad, but in all ways trying to comment on what these ideal roles should be. So I think in Alcina, we see what I find actually a fascinating array of different high voices, but not necessarily different high voices that are trying to tell you something about what a good man should be, just a lot of really good high voices trying to tell you about what their individual excellent humans should be. So we have a castrato. This was a very important role in Baroque opera, and I believe that Randall's going to be talking a little bit more about that. But these were men whose voices had been preserved in a higher range by being castrated when they were 9 or 10 years old. We have a few women sopranos singing characters that are women, and actually in the original production there was also a boy soprano that's been cut from this production, but you had another type of high voice. And high voices were extremely prized in the 17th and 18th century, but not necessarily associated on stage with femininity. There were all sorts of different ways of reading that high voice. In the case of some of the women singers, some people were reading this as a sign of good femininity. The excellent characteristics that they believed in of silence and chastity. Or it might be a sort of excellent woman in the sense that she was taking on masculine characteristics. So I think that's very much the case with Bradamante, who dresses as a man and tries to rescue her fiancé from the evil clutches of a witch. And in that sense, she's taking on some masculine roles, but being an excellent woman by doing so. And we also have some exceptional women who are probably exceptionally bad, with Morgana and Alcina herself, who are using their voices in a way that people in the 17th and 18th century found really troubling and really scaring, that women could maybe overpower men through sexuality, through the enticements of music. And so I think we see all these different kinds of exceptional people being depicted through these really amazing high voices. And Alcina lets us sort of sort through and see those. They're not necessarily the gender roles we have come to expect on opera stages. We're probably more used to seeing 19th century opera. And indeed, a different model of gender came up in the late 18th and 19th centuries that is closer to the gender roles that people recognize today or are fighting against today, where there's this idea of a binary gender where men have a role in society and women have a role in society, and they couldn't possibly mix or overlap. In Alcina's time, in Handel's time, they had not a model of gender that I would advocate for, but a different model of gender where people were thought to be on a sort of spectrum between femininity and masculinity. So it's also quite different in that sense. I hope that...
Awesome, yeah, that's a great introduction to some of the gender concepts in Alcina. I'm going to move along to Randall, who is not only countertenor extraordinaire, but he also has a Ph.D. in Baroque opera, which is very rare that you see people singing on major stages who also have doctorates. It's pretty incredible. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you first realized you were a countertenor, and then how having this PhD has helped inform you about these characters that you play.
Sure. So I was in college, started out as a baritone. I didn't have the path that a lot of countertenors have, which is starting out as a voice soprano and then through puberty when the voice changes, just continuing to keep that high voice strong. That was not my path. I played cello and I was in all the musicals and I was just sort of waiting to see what was going to settle. But I started college as a cello major and a baritone. And I was lucky because I was in Fort Collins, Colorado, and this was a few years back, before countertenors were what they are today, where it's more of a common thing now. People have probably heard of a countertenor, even if they don't know a lot about it. At that time, that wasn't the case. There were just a few big ones that were just starting to hit the scene. And I was singing along with the sopranos in choir when the baritones weren't, like just a little sectional moment. And I told my voice teacher about it afterwards, and he saw that as something unusual, which I didn't really, because I was always kind of just singing in this higher falsetto just for fun. And he took me over to a piano, and we ran through some scales, and I was really lucky because he had studied in Germany in the 70s, and he loved Bach. And that's one place where countertenors, even at that time, were being used in performance. Not so much on the opera stage, but in choirs and in Bach, you could find countertenors at that time. So he knew what it was. He knew that it was something that I could possibly make a career doing. He knew how to guide me in those initial months and years. I studied with him for another 2.5 years. And at one point, I was singing baritone, tenor, and countertenor, operatic arias from all three voices in the same term of college, while I was just, waiting to see how it was all going to settle. And then I came to Europe for the first time, sang for a teacher who's Andreas Scholl's teacher, if you know that name. And he said, yeah, this is great. You're producing the sound in a really natural way. If you want to be a countertenor, that's a thing you could probably do. And I didn't look back. I loved the history that was associated with it. The voice felt more natural to me as I was singing in that range. The progress that I made in 2 or 3 months' time was sort of night and day, just because I loved it and it felt right for me. And so then I just haven't looked back since then. And I guess that's, as succinct an answer as I can give for that. What else did you ask me?
About how studying Baroque opera informs you as a performer.
Yeah, so I have this Ph.D., and it was just something I got basically because I was interested in this one singer, Senesino, who Handel wrote Julius Caesar and the main role in Rosalinda and several others, like 13 operas I think Handel wrote for him. And I just loved his voice in Handel. I loved the way it sort of sat in terms of tessitura for me. The range was perfect. The drama of these characters just matched my personality. So I got really interested in who this guy was, and I started researching other music that was written for him. And I just went down a rabbit hole and got to a point where in order to keep learning about this guy that I was so fascinated with, I had to do a PhD in order to get access to the research and the manuscripts and all of that, and to properly do it, so that I had a clear focus for what I was doing. But the goal has never, for me, been purely an academic one. I mean, I would love to teach someday at a university, but I had always this eye towards performing. So, because I knew that what Handel had written for this singer fit me well, then everything else that was written for that singer should fit me well. And I wanted to I have this passion for also finding unknown things and kind of bringing them to light. I think we all think Handel is this amazing master, and he was, of course, but he wasn't the only one, and now if we know Handel, then a door is slightly open and we can start to learn about his colleagues and other people that were writing great music at that time. So that's what the PhD became for me, and then that all led to the recording that Alex mentioned in his intro that I did with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, which was all modern day premieres not by Handel, but Handel's contemporaries, and they were all things that people didn't know. So I was able to sort of tell this whole story of who this singer was. And it's just informed everything that I do, to be honest now, like the way that I approach repertoire, what I'm performing, it all now is connected a bit with the PhD. I can't separate that from who I am.
But there's contemporary opera now, a lot of contemporary opera that's also being written roles for countertenor.
Yeah.
So is it similar, different? How do you approach it compared to Handel?
So it took me a while in talking about sort of gender on the stage, these sort of gender archetypes. As a countertenor, I've always had this kind of big physique, and in the last several years, I've really lifted a lot of weights and things like that. But even before that, I am big on stage. So the roles that I wanted to perform were these kind of heroic leading roles. I do some other types, but that's kind of my bread and butter. And whether it's very contemporary opera or Baroque opera, it's usually that type of role that is the connection for me. And I sort of know how to access that person. And then the music that the type of music or the way the music is composed around them kind of fits into everything that I know about how to present this type of character. And also I had a thought while you were speaking that, these ideas of Baroque opera and gender and how they really represent the ideal of what we're supposed to, or what people at the time were supposed to see and emulate. There's this opera, La Griselda, which was hugely famous throughout the 17th, 18th century. And Griselda was the model of what a woman should be at the time. That's sort of known. People talk about that. And she got put through this series of challenges because this king fell in love with her. I won't talk too long, but this king fell in love with her, but she was a lowly shepherdess. And in order to prove that she was worthy of being his queen, he had to prove to his constituency that she really was worthy. She could represent all of these traits that you had to represent to be the queen. So he put her through this series of incredible challenges. He cast her out into the woods, and he was just really, really, really horrible to her. But in the end, she was this wonderful woman because she had endured all these trials and proven that she then could become the queen. So things like that are totally common in Baroque opera, and these ideals. And in order, this idea of the male characters, the types of characters that I play, there's always this duality between the lover and the soldier fighter. And that's always at the center of what these guys are trying to sort out throughout the course of an evening. And in Alcina, for example, he falls in love with Alcina, and he sort of forgets what it is to be a soldier. And there's 2 times in the opera where he comments on it and says that he's lost his reputation as a soldier because he's fallen in love. And her character comes along and tries to get him to snap out of it and kind of go back to his soldiering, because that's really at the heart of who this man should be. He shouldn't be so weak as to fall in love and have that throw him off track from these bigger picture male identity things that he should be representing. So it's everywhere, those kinds of examples.
Yeah, interesting. Annie talked a little bit about castrati, and I know you know a lot about this, so I'm hoping you can educate us a little bit and then talk about how these concepts of masculinity and femininity were portrayed by castrati.
Sure. Okay. So this is a topic I'm very interested in as a countertenor. A lot of the repertoire that I sing now was originally written for castrati. It's a fascinating topic. I'll just say a little bit about it. So, boys would start to train musically 5, 6, 7 years old in the local church choir. If they showed some promise, then around the age of 8, 9, 10, sometimes as late as 13, the head of music at the church would have a conversation with the parents and sort of say, if you want your son to have the chance of becoming a famous opera singer, and these guys were like Madonna or Beyonce today, they traveled all over the world, they made incredible sums of money, then we need to think about the surgery. And the parents generally were not of high status or means, so this was it was a nice prospect for them to think about. If their son could become so famous, then it would elevate the whole family. So they generally, as long as it wasn't the first son, it was, third or fourth son, then you could go ahead and undergo this. And I just find it interesting that it was so connected to the church, because the church was the one that would then often pay for the surgery to happen, and they would sort, making sure that the boy could travel wherever this needed to happen, which was often in the back room of barber shops at the time. You had to kind of know how to ask around for it because it was illegal. And then they would come back after the surgery and they would continue to train as a part of the church choir, kind of with this idea that they were indentured to the church for a few years because the church had put out this sum of money in order to have them, get the surgery. So they would continue to train, and then if they continued to develop, then they would slowly start to make their way onto the stage. Around 15, 16 years old, 17 years old. And they would often start performing female roles because in Baroque opera, this gender, it was about the voice. Gender didn't necessarily matter as much. There's a lot of roles that Handel wrote that are male roles that he wrote initially for female singers, that kind of thing. So they would start and they would get used to being on the stage and learning what it was to present themselves on stage as females. And then many of them would develop this sort of heroic side of what they could do, which was like the ultimate. But also, some of them were just so good at presenting women on stage that they did that their entire careers. So there's this fascinating, interplay between gender and voice and all of that. It's important to mention with the castrati, I think people often think because they had this surgery and something was removed from them that they are lacking something. But actually in the 18th century, they were viewed as embodying a whole that was male and female, because at the time when a boy he was seen as sort of embodying all of that until he hit puberty. Then he received what they called a final burst of heat. That's how they viewed it. And then that's when he would sort of develop into becoming a man. So the castrati were sort of frozen in this fascinating place where they really embodied aspects of both genders. And that made them very fascinating and intriguing to people. And then you separate that and put them on this stage where they're sort of, put up to be looked at as a spectacle almost. Like, I think they really only made sense when they were performing. Because of all that they'd been through in the training and everything else. That's where they were at their best. So people really did, men, women, they looked at them not only in terms of their talent, but also sexually. They were very desired. And the last thing I want to say before we pass on is that you couldn't just do this to your boy, but a lot of poor families didn't go the route that I just described, which was kind of the approved route, and they would just, have their kids castrated. And so in order to justify that, in one single year in the 18th century, there were 2,000 wild boar attacks in that part of the boy's body that then had facilitated, in order to save his life, of course, that he needed to undergo this surgery. So it's completely bogus and made up, but they had to come up with something in order to validate why they would do this to their children. And it was all just about the prospect of them becoming these famous singers who would travel the known world at the time, and they took that chance.
Wow, thank you. We're going to move back to Annie. You kind of touched on this a little bit with the female characters in Alcina. You've got Alcina herself, who is very dominant, Bradamante dressing up as a man in order to win her lover back. And then my character's gender, which has been changed back to the original. She was originally a woman. So can you talk a little bit about how the depictions of women specifically in our production, affect this opera?
Yeah, thanks. I actually really am intrigued by the change of Melissa back to Melissa. So in the original poem, the character's Melissa, and she accompanies Bradamante to go rescue Ruggiero. And in Handel's opera, he changed it to Melissa. I assume because he just wanted to have a bass. Because, you had a bass in the company, and great.
We really miss the bass voice in the choral numbers.
And yeah, so I think musically a bass works well, but also I think in terms of what I was talking about in Exceptional Women and this idea that some women could be exceptional by taking on what were perceived as masculine qualities at the time, Melissa really fits into that and is sort of a counterpart then also to Bradamante, or maybe even a greater extent than Bradamante, in the sense that she's wise and a sort of, motherly, fatherly figure. I think that works well in terms of the setup of the opera. Alcina is an interesting character in the sense that she probably, to a large extent, is there to depict the potential evils of powerful women, which was something that people, especially around the opera, were concerned about, because they had all these powerful women singers hanging around and demanding salaries and possibly having power over their audience members. So Alcina kind of, on some level, does represent the sort of potential evil of an overpowering woman. She also, particularly towards the end or later parts of the opera, does seem to kind of lose her rationality, which was another big stereotype of women. But at the same time, she is more sympathetic than she could be. And that some other female characters are in this period. So on some level, we are supposed to take her seriously as a human and sympathize with her and the journey that she's going on. And as I said, Bradamante is very interesting. As Randall mentioned, women sometimes played male roles on stage, and in fact, the singer who originally premiered Bradamante did a number of other roles for Handel where she wasn't a woman dressing as a man, she was just playing a male role. In this, she kind of takes on this other heroic part. And I think one of the reasons Baroque operas are so interesting is that they give us this range of different female roles that we can see, and different characters, and allow us to think about what all those different characters could be on stage in a way that maybe some more recent operas tend to have a more narrow vision of what women could be.
Awesome, thank you. Please don't be offended. I'm gonna move this way, and I'm sorry if you all are offended because my back has been to you, but we're gonna move away from the historical context of gender in opera and move into discussing current day gender identities. John here, Anita Spritzer, is a beloved local tenor who has done so much with Seattle Opera. You've pretty much grown up at this company. You were first in the chorus, and then smaller roles, and now this incredible role that you're singing in Alcina. But what our audiences might not have known about you until tonight is that you also perform as a drag artist. So I'm curious as to how you got into drag. Why did it appeal to you? And was it before or after you started singing opera?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I've been a performer since the dawn of time, right? So I've always performed and doing musicals and operas and plays. I was no stranger to dressing up in a costume, putting on stage makeup, and being a character. And so when I became 21 and started going to the clubs and being immersed in the LGBTQIA plus scene in the community, I was introduced to this art form that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, but also kind of similar to, there was a little thing in the back of my mind, wow, that's not so different from what I do in my career or in school at the time or things like that. And so I just decided to go for it and started learning about the art form. Actually learned a lot about it through music history class as yes, I know, woot, at PLU and dating back to Beijing opera and things of that nature. And so just kind of got into it, and I was able, luckily I was able to take everything that I had learned and was continuing to learn in my classical music career, and let that influence this new art form that isn't so distant, but it's a little bit out there, you know? And so I was able to take musicality and creativity and what I have learned about stage makeup, and now this is a little bit different than the makeup I wear, let's say, on the stage here at Seattle Opera, but there were a lot of things that influenced all of this. And bottom line, I just love entertaining people, and I love performing. And this was a way to do that, and maybe try something different and be creative and express myself in other ways that I don't normally get to do, I guess, on the stages in opera. So yeah.
Just a little bit of trivia, not trivia,
Okay.
information for everybody here.
Yeah.
You told me earlier today how long it took you to do your incredible makeup for tonight, so they know how much
Yes.
time you
2.5
took.
hours today it took me sitting in front of the mirror. Thank you. Oh, please. But I was relaxing, so normally I can do it in about 45 minutes, which is very fast. Normally I'm just in a dark, dimly lit room with a flickering light, so it's okay. But yeah.
Randall, you mentioned to me a while ago that one of your favorite performing experiences was in drag. So I'm curious as to how that compared or differed to what you do normally on stage.
I've seen pictures. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Looked
it
so
was.
good.
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is that you never really know where opera is going to come up. So I was performing in Brooklyn with what they called the Baroque Burlesque company. It was a lot of trained dancers from Juilliard, but then also this mix of all kinds of artists. There was a friend of mine who was singing operatically while she was doing the most amazing pole dancing routine. So my piece of that was that I started out in full drag. I had this huge pagne dress and a full breastplate and everything, just like epic queen kind of character. And I was singing the hardest Handel coloratura to open this set. I was supposed to be a goddess in the plot of the show. And so I opened that way. Then in the middle, I did a song by Leonard Cohen, which was a complete fan dance strip tease. So the dancers would come and kind of hide me with the fans, the feathers. And then, pieces came off until I was only in a jockstrap on stage. And then some other sort of more masculine pieces came on, and then I sang another Handel aria. So in the course of 3 songs, I went from this sort of like majestic female, then transitioning to becoming this sort of uber male, which is fun to just sort of play in that way. And I normally, because of my physique, I don't get to present female characters on stage. So that was the one time, and I really, really loved it.
C, I would love to bring you into the conversation now as a trans singer and ask you to share about your experiences, first with casting and perceptions of you as a performer. Where have you seen our industry's improvements in inclusion of trans and non-binary people? And then where do we fall short in support of our colleagues?
Great, thank you. I have some notes here.
Yes, please.
Just in case. A long day at school today. So interesting enough, and sometimes funny, my experience in casting and perceptions. One occasion, a little bit early in my career, I walked in for an audition for the role of Dido and came out with an offer as Aeneas. Which was the tenor role in Dido and Aeneas. So went in for a mezzo, came out as tenor role. And that was very interesting because during that process, I am a trans feminine singer, and the panel asked for my real voice and what I had to offer down there in terms of vocally down there. And I just looked at them and said, "Oh, I am a whole person, dear colleague, and you'll get the full range of my voice." And so it really was about, and I think I sang like "Where You Walk," a tenor aria from Semele by Handel, and but I was a bit ticked off by that question because I presented as a certain way and was expecting me to be expected and respected a certain way, and the panel just didn't do that in that instance. And so I chalk it up now to that being the past, and the industry and our community, artistic community has when you know better, you do better. And I think that shan't happen again any place for anyone when it comes to that. In terms of my experiences, secondly, is a very positive experience I had with a local Seattle-based opera collaborative recently. And that entire process, from the audition to the performances and then post-production, was really an element of just someone, a company or organization, really caring about me as an artist and as a human. And that was so positive and affirming and just really special for someone of the trans experience as I am to step in and not be questioned about my identity or my existence. So that was a welcome change in that respect. In terms of, you asked about industry improvement scene, one of the things I looked at as I am still in the audition process in the midst of a doctoral program, bless, I found what I'm finding now is that applications for work, for roles and auditions are now including things such as gender gender markers or gender pronouns or options for those things, which is really important because that wasn't there, 5 years ago even. And so seeing that there is at least an element for folks to begin to open their minds and their doors, opera companies opening their doors to dimensions of difference on the operatic stage. Where we fall short is actually producing work that's cast with trans and non-binary folk. Don't get me wrong. This singing is subjective, and auditions are subjective, and singing for most, if not all of us, is a job. I would agree. But the companies, I also felt in the wake of, dare I say, in the 2000s and 2020, 2021, made this shift, this seismic shift into incorporating a DEIA, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and access roles at opera companies. That's great, fantastic work. And so now I ask the question, what happens now? So what's next? What are the actionable steps that you're doing, or we are doing, or the collective is doing to better improve access and engagement levels for trans and non-binary people? The last thing I'll mention, though, I think is also important because there are intersections to this, and identity is very much, again, subjective, that for order for someone to, they don't have to say they're trans or non-binary, excuse me. People don't have to be visible for us to make space and create space for them. Just saying that we welcome, sounds cheesy, we welcome all is enough, and then actually, putting meaning behind those words, all.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned this a little bit, but I'm interested to hear about your thoughts about stories about trans non-binary identities being told on stage. We know this opera as one. I think it hit 100 productions last year, something like that, written by Laura Kaminsky and Mark Campbell. It's a coming-of-age story about a transgender woman named Hannah, and it depicts her journey through her transitions. But one of the criticisms that I often hear about this opera is that it was written by people who have no lived experience as these identities, and it is also not often, I think once I've seen, or maybe twice, sung with trans singers in these roles. So how do you feel about this, and what types of works and stories do you hope to be seeing commissioned in the future?
Oh my. Well, I give praise where praise is due. I think that the subject matter and the content and context of As One is great. This piece gives critical visibility to a trans experience, and let's be mindful of that. It gives a snapshot or a view of a person's experience. Trans people and non-binary people and gender-expansive people are not monolithic, and so glad that we have this and we're conversing about it now. But what else? I always ask, what's more? What's next for us as an art form? And so another work I enjoy as I'm beginning to look into it is called Opera Kardashian, and that work is a newer-ish work, I think 2018, 2019, by Dana Kaufman, composer, and Thomas Swift as a librettist. And that work, as the name Kardashian means or may resemble, features the role of Caitlyn Jenner in that opera. And in Dana Kaufman's writing and with her collaborator Tom Swift, that role is specifically cast for and designated for a trans feminine person. And so that is one way forward, I believe. When you look at sort of like the creators of As One, both Kaufman and Swift are cisgendered folk, but at least in this case, and I met Dana Kaufman a few times, it's really about the research gone into that work. As an artist, as an educator, I talk about my work to do no harm and making sure that folks are feeling included and being inclusive in my work. And so in that element, I really believe that there is space for trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary voices at the table. But I question about things like access. So, who are, this is just a question in my mind, how are folks of the trans or gender nonconforming or non-binary experience getting access to music education? How are we giving, teaching folks how to write, what to write, when to write it? I think it's an element of really trying to say, well, there's this gap of as far as I know, speaking in my own experience today, as of today, that aren't a lot of trans or non-conforming or non-binary opera composers. And if they are, where are their works? Please, let's present them, let's showcase them. And one way we can do that, I believe, is the element of chamber opera. Let's get some workshops going, and companies across the country or across the world could do this work. I think that one class I took at the Guildhall School was called Creative Voices, and that was a class with a very prominent mezzo-soprano. I was my teacher in that, and it was featured with one composer, one writer or librettist, one singer, and a pianist. And our task for the quarter, the semester, was to create a work in collaboration with each other. And so that course generated a lot of interest throughout school. But at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, we were able to really produce a one-person, two-person chamber song cycle or even chamber opera, so that we are talking about and doing the work together, teaching folks how to write for a trans voice, a non-binary voice. These things are not learned often in the academy, and so how do we find ways for folks to do that work? But the last point of your question, I just have my notes here. What types of work I wish to see? Not just stories about drama and death and tragedy. That gets old very quickly. It becomes tiresome. So trans and non-binary folks live, laugh, and love. Just as other folks do. And so really looking at how we can create the things that we often see in current LGBTQ plus two-spirited movies or shows, streaming shows, that can be adapted to somehow to be for stage work. That'll be great. So looking at how we can adapt those kind of works or create works like that for the operatic stage is my hope moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah, I think what you say about looking at that pipeline and looking at the access of where are we really focusing? If we're saying, oh, there's nobody out there, why is there nobody out there? I think that's a really important question to ask. And I also think that as we are looking at writing all these operas about traditionally marginalized communities, often all we see is their trauma on stage. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more to us than just trauma. So how can we show who we are as full human beings? That I think is really important. So thank you for mentioning that. I'm going to go back to John. And so I am normally used to hosting panels regarding race. And in those panels, oftentimes I'll tell a story about being in Washington, D.C., heading to go work at the Opera House and being standing on a train platform with another Asian American female colleague of mine. And we saw a large white man walking towards us kind of quickly, and both of us kind of stepped back really quickly from the edge of this the train platform, because this was at the time when there was a lot of Stop Asian Hate. Hate crimes happening, and it was kind of jarring to me that we both reacted in this way. But I think that this concept of living in fear is something that a good chunk of our population can't even fathom. And so I find that the best way to educate people who don't really understand what it means is by sharing our stories. So I'm interested in hearing about your experiences as a drag performer, as it's really under political attack right now. How do you feel about it being banned in certain states? Are you scared ever to be performing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's see. Yes, it is happening, has been happening for some time, and fortunately, I'll start with the fortunate part. Fortunately, we do live in an area that maybe is on the more outwardly supportive side. Not saying that there is not any hate or bad things happening over here, but we do live in an area that is fortunate enough for us, is predominantly accepting. However, I actually have had some dealings that have not been safe, and we've had to cancel shows that I have produced, shows that I have been in because of hate-directed and threats and whatnot. I think a lot of the time people are afraid about what they don't know and what they don't experience, and what they are not around on a regular basis. And that's why I think what we all do as performers and as people in an art form that allows for this kind of conversation and allows for us to be on stage expressing ourselves in the way that we do. I think it's really important that we do that. And that's why I do all of this is, yeah, it's fun and I get to wear big hair and bright colors, but it is political and it is a form of gender expression that I get to convey, whether it's on stage, sitting here talking to all of you, and hoping someone may see maybe a part of them up on stage, watching me perform or watching other drag performers perform, or they see something that they have never seen before and haven't come into contact before, and they have that conversation and the dialogue starts happening. I think that's what's not happening, is open dialogue is not happening. It's this is bad because I don't like it, because I think this, that, and this, versus actual factual things. And we were speaking a little bit before this panel in the back room, and I said, something that I try and remember, and it is always at the front of my mind, is I get to take all of this off at the end of the day, or at the end of the gig, or if I feel unsafe or things like that. And some people don't, especially trans people and trans people of color, do not, that they are living their truth and they are living as themselves. And I think while the subject of drag is a hot button issue right now, trans people and trans people of color especially are under attack as well. And that's something that is always at the forefront of my mind and should be at the forefront of all conversations surrounding things like this.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. Do you have anything you would like to add?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, and that's absolutely agree. I think that one of the things I talk a bit about with people, with company like you here, is that this doesn't come off. I am who I am, and my identity is my identity. And growing up, I am from Washington D.C. The other Washington, I hear you all say, but I'm from Washington D.C. and having to do that. And I'll just say this now, that I come from a place of immense privilege, even to be here today, even to be in Seattle, even to be in grad school, even to be in front of you today. And in that same realm, there are colleagues and friends and sisters who haven't made it. And by make it, I mean be alive, because of someone who felt that their existence was a mortal threat to them. And that is just beyond belief for me. Back at home we just say mind your business, but I think that it's important that we recognize that there is intersectionality to this. Of course, yes, being trans is one thing, but it seems as though, just in lived experience, but also in the media, in the world today, that being Black or African American and trans, or person of color and trans, is like two strikes. And that is of considerable concern when folks are just trying to do like others, live their best life, have a happy life, have a home, maybe food at the table and a place to live in, and maybe some spending money and call it a day. But I think that the folks are often, and by folks I'm using this generalizing people here, that some folks are just offended by just dimensions of difference, and that is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. In kind of transitioning this back to opera a little bit, I thought I'd ask you, John, I've seen some social media posts recently about, laws against drag performing, and people, opera lovers, saying, well, we won't even be able to produce Marriage of Figaro now because, you've got Cherubino. And so I'm interested if you can talk a little bit about how Cherubino is similar or not similar to what you do as a drag artist, and why would some people think, oh yes, it's okay to have Cherubino on stage, but no, it's not okay to have you perform?
Right. Isn't that funny? That is one of the pedestals we stand on in this conversation. Is this is not anything new. This is not anything that we haven't seen before. If you think of popular film, movies and TV shows, Mrs. Doubtfire and things like that. Like this is, dressing up in a costume has been around, and I speak strictly on dressing up in a costume. I think that is a good point that makes people think, especially people maybe are on the other side of not wanting to see gender-bending roles or drag performers on stage is, well, okay, if that's what we're going to do, then this means we cannot have this, that, and this. And then that's, whoa, that's too much. You can't take our Cherubino away. And so I think it is similar, and that's why, like I said before, I got into drag and how drag influences my opera career and how my opera career influences drag, is that it is very similar in the fact that I get to put on a costume and entertain people. Yeah, so I think that's, you hit the nail on the head there with, that is the comeback, if you will, when we get asked about things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in hearing where you've experienced some hope for our future as an operatic community, but also if you might throw out some tangible next steps, some simple, here's what you can do next to help support the trans and non-binary creatives.
Well, one of the hopes, I think, is a program I did during the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, there was lots of virtual things happening, and I participated in a virtual masterclass with a opera company out of Germany, and they had their first trans masterclass. Taught by a teacher based out of Arizona, and it was an experience over 4 days of people from around the world coming together on Zoom and singing for each other and learning from each other, and I think that is a way forward. That's a hope. I think that there's room for all of us. Room for all of us as artists, as musicians, as singers. And I think that through creating spaces like that for folks to, frankly, feel safe in an environment of just being with trans and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming folk is helpful. And in that, after that, with those 4 days of that masterclass, I've made some fantastic connections across the globe and other artists and other in different media, not just opera, but also in pop music and contemporary music as well. Next steps. And this question gives me pause because there's so many different ways to go. I think that opera is in its last stand in terms of the art form making shifts to be fully inclusive. So we see things like musical theater and cabaret shows and things of that nature being inclusive. Having award-winning artists from TV shows such as Pose go on to do things like Little Shop of Horrors. Go on to see folks on Broadway or off-Broadway do their work in their fullness of their transness. And so I think one of the ways I would like, or that gives me hope, is that although I am a sizable person with a sizable voice, that I too can find my space on professional stages and be given the opportunity to act and to tell a story the same way as another mezzo-soprano counterpart can do. I think that there is freedom in that. I was talking to the panel earlier today this evening, about Mozart and Handel and Puccini are long gone. So what's stopping us other than the Western classical canon to make changes? I mean, of course there's opera and key relationships and music and transposition, all of that, but the question is why? Why not? Why not? I mean, back in the day, I was what we called a party soprano. So after productions, we would have our cast parties, and as a full lyric dramatic mezzo-ish, I would then hop up to sing Archifus, Pamina's aria from Zauberflöte, and do that. Of course, I'm not looking to be cast as Pamina. Maybe. But I think that, at 6'2" and a few hundred pounds, honey, I don't think that's possible. But the world's the oyster. I think that we can suspend belief and we asking someone to play, Cherubino or Octavian and things of that nature. Why can't we begin to shift that as well for folks that are trans or non-binary?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Simple steps, no problem. Let's do it. I'm ready. We want to make sure that we have enough time to have some questions for the audience. So I'm going to ask a really quick lightning round question of all four of you. And it's like a 3-part question. And I just here's answer 1, 2, 3. Ready? Okay. So 1, how do you think we as an operatic community can become more inclusive for all? 2, and how can we use our art form to highlight this inclusivity for larger communities? And 3, as a bonus, how do we emphasize to our patrons and supporters that not only is this type of political work important to be doing today, because it is very important, but it's not new work. This has been going on for hundreds of years. I'm going to start with Annie.
So I'm going to leave the sort of production elements to everybody else who's a professional singer on the stage and talk about how I think we could be having these conversations about all kinds of different operas. Like, I think Baroque opera is a great way to invite people into a conversation about what gender is and how we're portraying it, because it's so different from what we expect. But I don't think we should naturalized 19th century opera roles. When we talk about voice types, we often go with a very easy, well, there are 2 or 3 types for women, and it's soprano, mezzo, alto, and there are 3 types for men, and it's tenor, baritone, bass. And actual humans and their actual lived experience and their actual voices are not easily fit into those strict categories. And I think I would love to see a conversation about that, or if we were performing Wagner or Verdi, just how constructed and strange the heroic tenor of the 19th century is. And I would love to have us then reflect on how our own ideas about people's voices are bound up in our ideas about what gender are. So I think opera really does have a really important thing to say here in that we expect certain voices, we associate certain voices with certain genders and certain ways of being in the world, but it doesn't have to be that way, and these are choices that change over time. And opera, in showing those things so clearly, like really lets us look at that. So I hope that answered some part of those three questions.
Absolutely. Randall?
Should I give it a go?
Yeah.
I think that the answer is the voice. Like, opera is ultimately about the voice, and if we can, I know that there are a lot of times when I have felt, when I've seen a countertenor on stage, this goes to sort of the bigger idea that everybody has to evolve just a little bit. Opera composers are writing these parts that I don't really relate to often for countertenors. It's sort of like one example in a modern opera I just saw was like a young, very petulant boy who has a fit because it's the wrong spoon for his tea, and that's a perfectly fine character to present. But when I was watching that particular opera, there's a mezzo who takes the stage in the middle of the opera and sings a beautiful aria with deep gravitas about big picture concepts. That's the one I wanted to sing. That's what I related to and wanted to present. So we have to get to a point where composers and society and on the whole, I guess, can see beyond these very narrow ideas of what voice part represents on stage. I would love to just be like a dad as a countertenor with a kid or something. Why does it have to be always this sort of like other character? Sometimes maybe a guy can just have a high voice who is, like more of a normal, for lack of a better word, character. So I would just say and that for me is all about the voice, just acknowledging the voice. That's an amazing voice. Let's put it on stage. Let's create work that this voice can shine in rather than trying to pigeonhole someone into something that already exists and doesn't suit them. And the way, I think, a lovely way to do that, to sort of elevate the consciousness and get people there is conversations like this. Like, I think what I've been really impressed with here at Seattle Opera is that Alcina is happening on stage. That is kind of the main event, but around it, there are so many talks and conversations and pieces of community outreach about aspects like, gender fluidity in opera, which is just a conversation that should be had. So I think just making space to have those conversations is probably the first and most important step.
Awesome. Thank you. John?
Yeah, I agree. And I think from a production standpoint, well, from a life standpoint, the world that we walk around in every day is reality, right? And so when presenting works, whether they're new works or works that have been around for hundreds of years, I think we have to realize that we are living in our reality right now as humans, and having experiences as those humans living right now. I think it's important for us to see the world we live in reflected on the stage as well. While it is great to see the rich history and these stories that are told, which I think there is space for those stories to be told, and it goes to what you were saying, is that there needs to be new works and chamber operas and chamber works and new works made that reflect our lives that we live in right now, because something that I cherish as an entertainer is connecting with people, that when I am on stage, someone in the audience, whether it be a young person, a young queer person, seeing something on stage that gives them the opportunity and the strength and the courage to live out their authentic life, I think is really important. So we need more of those stories to be made. And I think casting is a huge through line with everything that we're talking about as well, and being more inclusive in that as well.
Thank you. C.
I second or third that around the table. And if we're talking about Wagner, I call dibs on Erda. But I think that...
No fair, I want to sing Erda.
You both can.
Let's
We
do it
both
together.
can,
We'll split
absolutely.
it up. That's the joy of it.
Fantastic. I think that I'll take a different perspective here in terms of looking at org leadership and things of boards and management. I believe it's inviting people into spaces such as the program happening today, the program happening at the end of the month, where you have diverse persons coming to a space and engaging with them. Organizational boards typically look and act a certain way. How about we move to diversify the people in those spaces as well as bringing in new talent, which may not always mean new money, but I think what we get in terms of that are newer or fresher ideas, more open-mindedness and open ideas so that we can work to create art. So yes, it's one thing to be an artist on the stage or a stage director or dramaturg, what have you, but when it comes to management, I think that they also need to be a part of that conversation and ones leading that change.
Absolutely. Thank you. So that brings us to our audience questions. We don't have a ton of time, but we have time for a few questions, I believe, and it looks like Alex is coming down with the mic. So feel free to raise your hand and ask a question.
I'll be right there.
I actually don't need a mic, so I'll give you the mic. I know, I'm going to give you the mic. Got it. So, if you wouldn't mind. Okay. I can actually project pretty loud without one. So I want to go to both Steve's and John's point in terms of engaging and changing. One good thing that any large org like Seattle Opera could do is go to smaller organizations. So like one group that's amazing is CD Forum. They recently just got a new ED who happens to be a trans woman of color. And CD Forum has a rich history of working with trans and queer communities and BIPOC communities. Like that is one way to sort of diversify and get those stories. And then to an earlier point, it's not so much that the stories will be forgotten, but that they become ignored and then considered invalid.
First of all, thanks so much for this conversation, because it's really kind of all kinds of interesting questions are happening. And I want to touch on something that came up at the end about how it's about the voice. But in opera, the voice is embodied. And you have costume, and I'm looking at you, John, you have costume, you have wigs. How do we do this in a way that's respectful of the identity without devolving into things like stereotype and caricature? And yeah, you can do it in magic flute, right? Because it's a bird. But it's people. And so how do we do it in a way that's really, really respectful?
You've stumped us. Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting perspective. And I think, yes, we are individuals, and I think that it depends on the stories that we set forth to tell, and I think that has to do with production and from a management standpoint, like you were speaking of. So I think that's a really great way of a great question to, and I don't think that a lot of these questions that you've been asking and that we've been talking about, I know I am not the only, person that can provide insight for these questions, and you're not the only person that can provide insight, and vice versa. And so I think that these questions will continue to evolve, and these answers will continue to evolve as well.
And I think that if we go to people with lived experiences with these identities and talk to them and listen and learn from them, that's the first step as far as staying away from stereotypes, is giving people the opportunity to tell the stories that they live and they want to tell.
I also kind of want to say, whether it's valid or not, but it seems to me that opera is a pretty flexible art form in some ways. And I think if someone is in front of you and showing you who they are, if you're a great director, you can find a way to include that in a concept that lets them shine as who they are themselves, whether it's Carabino, as a boy or a girl or whatever it is. I mean, I think that it's just about great ideas too, and then how those can manifest in these productions in new ways than maybe what we expect. Seems to me that's one way forward.
Question? Any other questions? Down here.
It seems like a lot of the modern operas are almost documentaries. I mean, there's Nixon and there's Malcolm X, and they're not fantasies. And then there's been also an outcry about if it's about an Indian should play the part, or sing the part, or if it's about a black person should sing the part. I was wondering how you feel about that. Should a thin white woman sing Malcolm X? I don't know.
I think I would say, again, I don't have to cast operas, so this isn't my problem. But as a patron of the opera and a person who thinks about these things, I think it does depend on the specific opera and the specific role that you're talking about. I don't think there are good general rules to create around that. I would be very skeptical of seeing a white person cast as Malcolm X, and I think it would be very hard to go to an opera company that was doing that. And I think that there are just power relations going on there that aren't going on if you're casting Traviata, that you have to, or Magic Flute, that are important to think about. I don't think it's easy to sort of extrapolate out what in a completely sort of blank slate kind of world, what rules we would make, when in the real world we do live with existing histories and existing relationships between people. So that would be my, again, as a person who is never going to have to make those choices.
Something I talk a lot about is I do a lot of advising on Madame Butterfly, and the question comes up all the time: should it be cast with Asian singers? It wasn't written for Asian singers to sing it. Should it be? And something I talk about a lot is equity, right? And so it can be, yes, you can have an Asian singer, but it can't be the only thing. Yes, and. So how do we create equity? How do we come close to trying to create equity within our industry? And I think that's a big question. So taking an opera about a traditionally marginalized community and giving it that role to a white man, that's the opposite of equity. And so I think that's a big part of the picture as well.
I do also want to say, you commented on how you feel sometimes contemporary operas are sort of like documentaries, and it's all just sort of like informing in a way that it feels just like information. And I don't think that you're wrong. I think there are some wonderful contemporary operas, but the reason that I think that they're wonderful is because you can get inside the story and just show us a viewpoint. That's what's cathartic and so wonderful about opera, is that it can bring an audience along and put you right in the middle of a situation if it's done really well, and if you connect into the emotions and that are inherently there in the music, rather than sort of just listing things or educating an audience. I think that's really the way to transform the art form, is to get inside the art and to show the experience on stage. But it's not easily done,
Time for one more question. One more question. No more questions. Anybody? Oh, okay. One more question.
I think I saw the hand up and back go up first.
For those of us who are working on educating the next generation of singers and performers in this world, what are things that those of you involved in gender fluid productions and gender fluid concepts would advise us to speak to our students about, and what are things that are missing in coachings and in voice lessons and in production direction classes that could help move us into the new sort of era of this concept.
Thoughts? One of the things I tell a lot of young students is to learn how to ask questions and be interested, but ask in a respectful way. Don't be afraid to ask rather than just assuming. And that's something that I think a lot of, anyone can learn. Like, I'm never offended if someone comes and asks me about my lived experience in a respectful way. So that's something I tell young singers a lot. Learn how to ask.
Absolutely. I believe for many reasons, for advocacy and agency in the classroom or the studio, that folks, in terms of being educated and educating folks, often if we're talking higher education, folks are paying to be educated and paying for voice lessons and whatnot, and so why not ask those questions that you need answers to. In terms of what teachers can do and administration can do, for me is to open that door. I mean, I think that we live in this environment to where there is a singular route to get to success in music, and not everyone's path is the same path. And I think that how do we curate or become a co-creator with our students to help them develop who they want to be and where they want to be after their time with us, or during their time with us, but also eventually as they graduate or as they move forward in their education. In terms of what that looks like in the studio, I tell my students, your voice is your voice where it is today. That may shift throughout time, but you are in your space. Your voice matters, and your voice is your voice. Go forth and do. And in that instance, looking at or working with trans and non-binary students, I look for resources. There's a resource here I have, a music shelf anthology of new music created by Aidan Feldkamp, specifically on, this volume is on trans and non-binary voices, which is a collection of about, I think, 30 or 40 pieces in this volume, that incorporates songs and opera arias from folks that are writing for these voices in mind.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a really good one. And as a person who works in a university, I'm also thinking a lot about how we can be the best educators that we can be for new musicians. And I was really struck by the story that you told of your professor in college, like hearing your voice and seeing that as like an opportunity and a wonderful thing and something that you could be encouraged in. So I do think knowing as faculty or as teachers to also be curious on your own end and be interested in what is going on with the student and thinking about them as an individual and listening to them when they're talking to you. I mean, that's a very broad answer for I have no vocal techniques. But I think that that's a really important place to start out as when you're teaching.
I think what we really want to see from singers is them giving us their truth. And if you can create the space for that, then that's maybe just the biggest thing, because that's what I think hasn't existed. And you have to be so brave to put yourself out there authentically. And I think, this is just my idea, but I do think that when people do that, they can find a way forward. Not always, because it's about a lot of other things, but I think that's just a big step, is if you can present yourself authentically and you have the place to do that in a university or an encouraging teacher, resources like this that can show you the types of music that you might relate to, then I think you're ahead of the game. And then it's possible, if you're showing your authentic self, then the path can hopefully present itself.
Shall we leave it there? Thank you. I want to thank our panel for being here and being brave and honest and open and sharing your truths with us here tonight. I know it's not easy always, so thank you for being here. This is not always a comfortable conversation, and if you're interested in learning more about some of these issues and what Opera America is doing to make the industry more safe and inclusive for gender diverse opera professionals, you can feel free to check out their website. There's a great conversation there or on YouTube. And most importantly, if you haven't come to the opera, please come. Let us know what you think. And if you've come already, thank you so much for attending. And thank you all for being here tonight.